Happy New Year, everybody. I hope you guys had a great holiday. Over the holiday, I had actually made a material that used a combination of switches and color IDs and functions to change colors. And I thought it would be interesting to actually just go into the mechanics of how all that switching works. Without getting into the details of like building a super complicated material. So I thought for this time around what I would do is just basically this simple exercise material where we can learn how to use a combination of functions and switches and color IDs to create a great deal of versatility as far as like the procedural stuff that happens in our material. We're going to be able to switch out the material that we're using for our animation. We're also going to be able to pick the animation. Actually, that doesn't really work because it's going right over that. Let's switch it back to pyramids. So we're going to be able to switch the type of animation, and we're also going to be able to switch the direction in which that animation rolls or doesn't roll at all. We're going to be able to adjust the speed and the location. And that's just the animation. The other thing we're going to do in our exercise is we're going to create these metal patterns that we can also adjust, and we'll be able to adjust their colors as well. And, you know, again, this is really an exercise in learning how to use, you know, the actual nodes themselves. So the material is really nothing to write home about. But the techniques that you're going to learn here, you can apply to pretty much anything. And I'm using this metal material because it's like super easy to make and it still doesn't look crappy. And here we are in substance, and this is that actual material in its graph. We're going to come up here, we're going to make new substance, and we're going to use the PBR template, and let's just go ahead and call this switch exercise. And we're going to add, you know, I'm just going to duplicate this. We're going to add a specular level to it. So I've duplicated this node. I'm double clicking on the node, and I'm going to come in here. Let's try that again. I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to change its attributes. So we're going to call this specular level. And I'm also going to bring my height next to my normal. Uh-oh. What's going on here? Oh, you know what's going on here? I forgot the most important thing. I forgot to change the actual attribute, and that is going to be specular level. And that's what it's actually showing here. So your labels are really only for like end users and stuff and like inputs and outputs. But the actual job of the node is going to be what's here. So that makes sense now. All right. Like I said, we're not really going to worry about the material itself. I'm just going to get a normal color here because we're not going to even put a normal on our basic, you know, the base metal. We're going to create a bunch of textures for it, but this is going to be sort of the underlying flat metal, which is what I'm going to make now. So we're going to need a normal, and then we're just going to grab up a couple of colors to stand in for our roughness. So we want these grayscale, and I want it pretty smooth, so I'll set the roughness as something like that for now. And then this is going to be, this one is going to be our specular level, so we're going to set that up pretty high. And we can start plugging this stuff in. So we have our roughness. We have our specular level, our normal. You know what? I'm going to get rid of this height. We're not going to use height. I'm going to duplicate this out for our color for the moment, but I'm going to change it back to a color. I'm going to keep the actual color the same, but I want it to be an actual color node as opposed to a grayscale node. And the one thing we don't have yet is metallic, and that we want grayscale and 100% metallic. And we have this basic, very, very basic metal form. I'm going to move that back. I've been doing that all day for some reason. Butterfingers. Okay. So this is going to be sort of the underlying metal that we're going to now start to work on. So the first thing I'm going to do, we are going to get a multi-material blend. We are going to use switches to manipulate this color ID in here. And I've used multi-material blends before, so you know we'll go over it again here. But this is actually a great node because you can blend any number of materials. You can actually set how many you're going to blend. We're going to set this to 4, by the way. And each one of those materials, excluding this background material, this last one down here is your background material. So it won't start at 2. It'll start at, it won't start at 1. It'll start at 2. And each one of them has a very specific color assigned to it. Right now it's all the same, but we're going to take care of that in a minute. And you can also dictate which channels are going to be used. Now, right now, we're not even interested in this metallic because that's not going to change. What we're trying to do here is set up a blend that's going to allow us to take this background material, which is what this is. Actually, I'm looking at the output nodes. We should be looking at this stuff in here. So the metallic we're going to leave alone. We only have 4 outputs here. We don't even have, we're not even going to use the color on this one. So the metallic and the color, we're not going to deal with in this blend. The metallic we're not going to blend at all, and the color is going to get its own blend because we're going to allow, we're going to fix it so that we can switch the colors around procedurally. So we're only really dealing with these 3 nodes here. We've got the normal, we've got the roughness, and we've got the specular level. So I'm going to come into my material blend, my multi-material blend, and I'm just going to turn on only the channels that I need. I don't want specular, I want specular level. It's further down. And I will turn this on. Again, this is a very basic material, so we're not doing AO or anything like that. We're not going to use height. So we now have the corresponding number of inputs in here to what we have going on out here. So this one we're going to use for our background. So we have specular level, roughness, and normal. And we're going to go ahead and replug these guys back in here into our actual outputs. So as far as our rendering goes, it has changed absolutely nothing, but we're starting to set up this blend for ourselves. Now, the trick is going to happen in here, and I'm going to save that. Let's go ahead and build the actual textures that we're going to lay on top of here, and we're going to do that using an effects map. And again, we're going to keep things very, very simple. I'm switching it to grayscale, and then I'm right-clicking on it, and we're going to click Edit Effects Map. And let's just make a bunch of these quadrants. So I'm hitting the space bar, quadrant, quadrant. I don't know, have we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's see how that works. So I'm on this last one because that's where my image is going to go. And right now it's showing up as black because I got absolutely nothing there. But we're going to put something in. So in pattern, let's put in a disk. Yeah, I think that would make a nice metal pattern. It's still very gray though, because we're going to need this as a mask. Now, if I come on to the actual node itself, not in the FX map, but on the node out here, it has something called global opacity. And I can bring that number up until I like what I see out here as far as it being a good mask. That should be pretty good. So that's 1. Let's, to save ourselves the trouble of making all those quadrants, I'm going to duplicate this. And I'm going to right-click, Edit Effects Map. Now this is our second one, so we can change just the input image. Let's change it to a pyramid, and maybe turn it. And let's see what happens if we play with our widths and our heights. Let's go above 1. Let's do, yeah, it's kind of nice, a little basket weave. So that can be our second pattern. And I'm going to come back to this first one because it's square. And I'm going to duplicate that again. I'm hitting Control D. And we can make a third pattern. Why don't we just make those same diamonds, only just like not elongating them, leaving them alone. So again, I'm coming back in here. And we're going to change this to pyramid. And we're just going to leave it like that because I think that's kind of nice too. So we've got our pyramids, we've got our rectangles, and we've got our dots. And I guess I'll start with my dots, and we're just going to do this like I have it in my notes. I'm going to put a levels node in here just in case I want to adjust this in any way. I'm going to get a normal, because now I do want some kind of normal for, you know, for my metal. And I'm going to tone, in my notes I had it as 0.07, but again, that's all to taste. You know, it depends on how chunky you want it. We're going to need an ambient occlusion. And I'm going to do some work on this. Now, it's being pretty laggy right now. There's a bunch of things. You know, ambient occlusion it's a pretty dense node. It tends to be heavy. But there's some stuff you can do to that. First of all, you can adjust the height depth. We don't need, I mean, this is a shallow metal texture. We don't need this all the way up. We can set it down, and we can also set the radius of where it's doing the occluding all the way down as well, because we don't really need either one of those things. And you can see already it's about half the size as it was before. The other thing we can do is we can actually adjust the quality of it. So it's like in the mid-range by default, so we can lower it down again, because again, we don't need any kind of serious detail in here. And finally, I'm going to click GPU optimization to on. And we went from 111 or whatever it was down to 10.6 milliseconds as far as how that node is functioning, how long it takes to process it. So yeah, you want to optimize it if you can. You know, it's a dense node, but they do give you options. So if you really need a very detailed ambient occlusion, you can get it. But if you don't need to get, you know, you can actually tone it down quite radically. I'm going to also get an invert grayscale, and I'm going to run it off of this levels. If we end up not using it, we can always just do it directly off of this. And I'm going to get another levels node, and this is going to be our roughness, because I've made the decision that I want my deeper areas rougher than the areas on top. If you want it differently, then don't invert it. But I'm giving it its own separate levels node because I can now just globally bring everything down. So the higher bits are still shinier, but the whole thing is in fact shiny. And we're going to kind of use the same idea for the specular level, only we're not inverting it because I kind of want it to be the opposite of what's going on in my roughness, because the bits that are the roughest will be the least specular. And here I'm going to kind of do the opposite, because I want everything to be specular, but the deeper bits to be slightly less specular than the bits on top. And that is our basic metal setup. We have our FX map, we have a levels node, and then we have all this other stuff going on. I'm going to draw a frame around it. This frame is for our dots, and I am just going to duplicate each one of these out again so that we can replace the dots with our other two textures. So this one is our rectangles. I'm going to change the name of the frame, and I will hold down Shift and switch my nodes, and I'm going to get rid of this one. And this one we'll call pyramids, and we'll do the same thing here. I'm holding down Shift, I'm dragging that node, and I'm putting it in there. Okay, so now it's just a question of putting these guys in the multi-material blend. So what have I got? Oh, the AO. We're gonna do the AO later, so we're gonna leave that out of here. Yeah, I said color and metallic, also AO. Forgot about that one. I'm gonna bring that in here, and then the next one is roughness, and then specular level. Oops. Sometimes I do this because it's easier. All right, so we now have this set up, but none of these guys are showing up. We're still getting that flat background, and that's because in order for it to work, we actually have to have this color ID set up. And that's what we're going to do next. Now, when I was doing this, it's going to what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign each one of these frames a color, and that's what I'm going to use for my color ID mask. And I mean, this has got nothing to do with anything other than just making it easier, because we're going to, you know, all these colors have to correspond to an integer or to a Boolean, and it's easier to keep it straight for me, at least, if I assign my colors on these frames as well. So I'm just going to assign the same colors I had in my notes. so that I don't screw up. So these colors here on the frames are going to correspond to the colors we're going to assign to each one of these textures in that color ID. So let's go ahead and begin to make our input parameters so we can start sort of matching up our colors and numbers, etc. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create an input called metal pattern. And this one is going to allow us to pick out which of these patterns we want to use. And to do that, I want a drop-down list. So it's going to be an integer 1, and then I'm going to change the format to drop-down list. And this will allow me to actually assign integer numbers to anything I want. So we have pyramids. I'm going to add an item. We'll have rectangles. I'll add an item. We'll have dots. And then, just to be super cool, we're going to add another item, and we're going to call this multi. And what we're going to build here is a material. It'll give us the option of having, a single texture all over the whole thing, or that animation business with the moving around of the different materials that we saw sort of in the intro part. So we have now got this integer 1 value in the form of a drop-down list. And these are our integer values right here. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3. What the end user sees is pyramids, rectangles, dots, and multi. But this allows us to take these text selections and use them in a function because each one has been assigned to a very specific integer number. In fact, you can see it's not going to allow you to double up on these numbers. That's an error. It's not going to let you. It has to be a unique number. Okay, so let's come back to our color ID here. And I just got a color, and I plugged it in. And if we take a closer look at what's happening here, oh, you know what? We never assigned these. I'm sorry. Let's come back to our multi-material blend and actually assign colors. In fact, let's assign the colors that we did here into this blend. So I'm going to minimize that channels, and I'm going to take a look at my colors too. So that's this one right here. That corresponds to pyramids. So I'm going to assign pyramids pure blue, 255 in the blue channel. The next one up, is our rectangles. So that's material 3, and we're going to assign that pure red. And finally, for our dots, we've got green. So material 4 is green. Why isn't this? Oh, you know why? Because I haven't actually done anything here. Let's take a look at before we actually start putting a function on here. Let's see if it works. So that's our material. If we have it on red, it switches to the rectangles texture. If we have it on green, it switches to the dots texture. And if we have it on blue, it switches to the diamond texture. I think I'd like to see more chunkiness on that, so I'm going to... Now, let's do it on the diamonds since that's the one we have set up right now. Yeah, let's set it back up to 1. So I'm just going to go back to each one of these normal nodes and just set it up to 1. I like that better. Okay, but we were just changing these manually. What we need to do now is put a function on this output color right here that's going to switch these colors according to this input parameter that we made with the integer 1. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to create an empty function, and then I'm going to click on it, and that will bring us into the actual function. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab up my variable, metal pattern. And I'm going to get a bunch of other things here. We're going to need an equals. Now, the expected output here is either a float 1 or a float 4. We're doing a color, so that means that we're going to want a float 4 as our output. It's not going to accept a float 3 or a float 2. And a float 1 is not going to have enough information for us. So we know we're going to need a vector float 4. We're also going to need some vector float 2s. And then we're going to need a bunch of numbers. Now, for here, we could use either a constant or an integer. Oh, we could use either a float or an integer here in this particular case, because the floats, we're only going to use them as whole numbers. Integers need to be whole. So it doesn't really matter. I'm going to use floats in this case because that means I can use them in here without converting them, but I can also use them for the comparison to my variable. As long as they stay whole numbers, it will not give it a problem. And then the other thing we're going to need is an if-else. And we're actually going to need a whole bunch of all of these things, but we're going to be able to duplicate things out now. So let's begin our statement. If metal pattern equals 3, which is our multi, come back in here. So if people pick multi, I want this to be absolutely transparent. I don't want to see it because we're going to end up putting this on top of, we're going to blend it, and we're going to do it as a copy. So if I lay this on the stuff that's going to come in through here, which is going to be all of the information for the more complicated material. This is the simplest part of it, so we're starting with this one. It's just going to lay on top of it. So I don't want to take care of that in this blend. I want to take care of it in this color. So what I wanted to do, if this is 3, is I want it to be completely transparent. And here is where the vectoring comes in. In order to be completely transparent, it has no color and no alpha. These vector flow 2s, we are chopping up the red, green, blue, and alpha channels because we're going to need to pair them up in different ways. And then the result is always going to get vectored into this float 4. So this right here with all zeros represents your checkerboard pattern. So what we're saying, if the metal pattern equals 3, then I want to see absolutely nothing at all. And you can see we just got rid of that color. But if you come back into here and we switch these out, nothing's happening. And that's because we haven't, this is also nothing. So if metal pattern equals 3, then nothing. Otherwise, something. And now we have to figure out what that something is. So the first one we've got here is pyramids. I'm going to duplicate this guy. So if metal pattern equals 0, I want my pyramids, we have them set as blue, I believe. Yes, pyramids are blue. And that's why I do that, because I don't have to keep checking different spots for it. I'm going to take this, I'm going to duplicate it, and instead of having 0, we're going to have blue. And to do that, I'm going to get another constant. I'm going to set it to 255. Now, I want my alpha, and so that's RGB, and my blue to be 255. So if metal pattern equals 0, then this. Otherwise, and we're going to make another statement now. I'm going to duplicate, in fact, I'm going to duplicate all of them. And I'm going to get rid of this just so it's not confusing. All right, so we've done 0 is our pyramids. Let's come back and see what our next number is. Number 1 is rectangles, and number 2 is dots. So I'm going to get another float. I'm going to set this to number 1. So if metal pattern equals number 1, I completely forgot what I said before. So metal pattern equals number 1, it's rectangles, and it's red. So that means we need to have red, R, is 255, green is 0, blue is 0, and we want it opaque, so that will also be 255. And finally, we don't really need to do another number here because the only other option, we've taken care of number 3 up here, the only other number left is 2. And all we need to do here is just duplicate this out and set it up for green, which is our last color. So I'm going to set this to 0, so that's red, green. And that will go in here, and then this one goes in here, and this one goes in here. So if metal pattern equals 3, that means we've got the all over pattern. Otherwise, we've got nothing. If it's not the number 3, then that's your else statement. And we've got this kind of like a nested doll thing, and we've got the other statements going on in here. So going down the line, if that integer equals 1, then we have this color happening. Actually, if it's 0, we have this color happening. If it's 1, we have this color happening. And if it's neither of these things, we have this final color happening. And let's take a look and make sure that it works. So we have it set at dots, which is green, rectangles, which is red, pyramids, which is blue, and then if we have it on multi, we've got nothing. And that's exactly what we want to see happening here. So that works. So that's our whole color. Now we have to work on the multi-bit. Move that up here. We'll give ourselves a little bit more room. So the first thing I actually want to take care of is creating a new input parameter here. Well, several new input parameters. We're going to call these multi-metal, and I'm going to have one for each of my textures. So let's start with dots, and they're all going to be identical so we can copy them out. What we're going to do here is we're going to, instead of having two float 2s, because we're going to use this to manipulate the size and position of each of these textures, and it's going to allow us to, move those metal textures around how we want them to. And instead of doing two float 2s, I'm going to do a single float 4 for each material, because it's just, it becomes more, well, two reasons. It's more elegant from a UI point of view, but it's also more efficient because you're only using one variable to do two jobs. So it's more efficient also from a processing point of view. So float 4. And once I do that, I can come down here and actually create labels that will be visible to the end user. So we can set this as size X, that's Y, and we'll call this position X and position Y. And we'll have the default going between 0 and 1, which is fine. I think I'll set all of these for the moment. For 0.5, we're going to move, well, I'll move this one up here. We'll set the position for each one of them slightly different, so they'll lay out, but I'll have the size as a default for 0.5. And that looks about right. Oh, we still need a label. So we're going to call this, the group will call multi-metal, and the label will call dots. And I'm going to make a copy of this. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to paste that input. And this one I'll call rectangles. And I'll change the position. So I just don't want them all laying on top of each other as the default. That's there's no real reason why this should be anywhere. It's just this way they're not all stacked on top of each other. So you can see them once we get this going. And we're going to make one more copy for our pyramids. Oh, sorry, that was my size. Hold on, let me do this. All right. So what we need to do now is replace this sort of flat color with that. And now we have to figure out what we're going to plug into this background, because the foreground is getting taken care of by this. And now we have to figure out a background that's going to allow us to manipulate these different textures. We're going to use, for that, we're going to use shapes. We're going to have a shape for each one of these. But since I'm putting a function on it, I might as well do one and then we'll duplicate it out after we've put the function on it. And we're also going to want a transform to move it around. So we're going to do the shape XY on here and then the position XY on here. And the reason I'm not doing the shape on the transform as well, because you can. The way transform nodes work, if we take a look at this matrix, is that, well, we can't really see anything. Well, just take it from me that this is talking about tiling. These numbers talk about tiling, and it's a completely different format than what's going on with the shape when you're talking about X and Y's, and they're moving in the opposite direction. And it's way more math. I mean, I'm sure there's a mathematical way of expressing that. I'm not the person that's going to be doing that expression. So I just break it up into two nodes because that's just too much math for me. So what we're going to change here is the size. And again, I'm going to create an empty function. I'm going to come in here. We're going to get our variable. Now we created a float 4. And we're talking about dots here. And we're going to get a swizzle float 2. So if we come back and look at our original input parameter, our size is label 0 and label 1, which corresponds to x and y. And then this is z, and then this is w. So this is actually set up exactly like we want, because we're taking the x and the y values from this float 4. And if you look at the swizzle, you can see each one of these, you can pick out which value you want to swizzle into a float 2. We're going to set this as our output node. And if we look at this, it's changed that shape because we'd already set in defaults. Now on this transform, what we're going to do is we are going to take the same, I forget what we called it, multi-metal dots. We're going to use a swizzle again. I'm going to copy this, Control C. I'm going to go into my transform, only this time I'm going into my offset, and I'm creating an empty function. I'm going to paste that in here, but now I don't want the XY, I want the Z and the W. So it's taking the second 2 numbers out of that float 4 and swizzling them out into a float 2. And now it's moved it for me into the position that I had set at the default. I'm going to get a blend, and I'm going to set this as my mask, and then I'm going to get a color, and we're saying dots are green, and that is the color I'm going to use for this mask. So I want my alpha to remain at 255, and I'm going to bring my green up to 255. Now, I'm being very, very precise about this on purpose, and I'll show you why in a little bit, but first let's get these things built. So that's my green. So I now have a color that I can use in this color ID that corresponds to my dot's size and its position. And I can do it off of this single variable. Let's take a look in the preview. So I can change its size, and I can change its size in the Y, and I can move it in the X, and I can move it in the Y. And I'm just going to click back out without hitting apply, and it's going to bring me back to where I was when I started. And this is the basic formula that we're going to use for all 3 of our colors. So all I really need to do is duplicate this out a couple more times, switch my colors. So rectangles is going to be red, and then I want to make sure that this is changed to rectangles, and this is changed to rectangles, and my color is switched to red. And we'll do the same thing with the blue. And we're going to get some more blend nodes, and we can blend these guys together. And there we have it. We have our materials, we have our different textures, and we have a switch that's going to allow us to decide whether or not we want to have this multi-thing going on or the single texture. Now, before we go any further, I want to talk to you about the reason why I'm being super precise with these colors. Well, let's see what happens if we just mess around with this green a little bit. Here it is. It's up at pure green. As I move this just a very little bit, you'll notice how all of a sudden this mask doesn't work anymore. It's like disappeared. I mean, you can hardly even tell the difference between the green. And that's because it is really, really, really precise. So by 245, so just, 10 points off, it's already completely gone. By 252, it's only halfway there. And, if you're going to be doing this can be a real problem, because sometimes, because you're using masks and other things, sometimes you're off by like 4 or 5 pixels because of opacities and stuff like that, and it can be a real problem. But there's something for that. If we come into the actual multi-material blend, there's a thing down here called fuzziness, and padding for that matter. I mean, you can pad these things too, but The one I want to talk about is fuzziness. This is not talking about edges. It's talking about the fuzziness as to how many, the sampling of that color. So as I move this fuzziness up, it's accepting a wider range from that initial 255 that I've set in. So it's maybe looking at 245 and stuff now. You can go too far with it also. So there's a limit, because it can go so far out that it starts bleeding into some of your other colors. So basically what you try to do is get it as precise as you can before it comes into here, but just know that if you need to, you can actually adjust this fuzziness in the multi-material blend itself. So I'm going to come back into here and I'm going to make it precise because I can. But I did want to show you that, and that is why I'm being a real stickler with exactly the numbers that I'm putting in. And this way, when the functions and these are all quite literally exactly the same color, and that's important. Now, the next thing we need to work on is our animation. And before we do that, let's make the input parameters that we're going to need to use. Well, actually, I'm going to get rid of this. We're going to want to be able to change the pattern. It's not going to be exactly like this, but it's close enough that I'm going to copy my metal pattern. I'm going to paste it, and then we're going to change it. So we'll call this animation pattern. We can get rid of this number 1. Yeah, there's an extra one down there. I know this because if I do, watch this. Yeah, you see that multi is still in there, and I'm just going to get rid of this one. I haven't figured out a way of making that happen. I'm going to just change it like this. And I just want to make sure that that does indeed, these numbers have to be right. This has to be exactly the same. So we have pyramids, rectangles, dots. Okay. So this is going to be the animation, this is going to be the pattern that's going to be on top of the animation. So we can switch that separately. The other thing we want to do is to be able to change the direction of our animation. And again, we're going to have this as an integer with a drop-down list. And so 0 we'll have as off. And then we'll go to the left. And then we'll go to the right. So again, we're assigning these integers to these labels that the end user can see. And we will call this animation direction. And finally, we're going to make an input parameter that's going to kind of deal with everything else. And I'm going to use a float 3. We're kind of wedging something in here, but honestly, this isn't about making input parameters. It's about, using these color IDs and switches and functions to get it all to kind of work together. I probably should do this as 2, but I'm just going to do it as 1. I'm going to have my animation number. We're going to be able to switch from one animation style to another. We're going to have our speed. And we're going to have our location. And the reason this isn't going to be, actually let's make location Y, because it's a band running across, so there's no real location X. It's just going to go up and down. The problem's going to come in here. This one wants to be an integer, and these two want to have incremental values. So we're just going to fudge this one up here a little bit. It's going to work. It's just going to, I wouldn't sell it like that. Let's put it that way. And we'll call this animation details. Okay. So those are the input parameters we're going to be using. And we can now start working on the actual stuff that we're going to animate. I'm going to come back into my library. Again, I'm keeping it super simple. Because this lesson isn't about making a beautiful material. It's about learning how we can get these nodes to interact with each other. I'm just going to just keep it simple. I'll give this a 45-degree turn, and then I'll bring the size down to where it's something like that. And since we said we wanted to have 2 of these, I'm going to create a second one that's just based off of this one. And, feel free to insert your own stuff in here. And I don't want them to tile, so I'm coming in here, and I'm going to set the tiling mode to absolute with no tiling. I will then get a blend node and use a lighten blend, and I'm just making it different. This is really not art at all, but it'll just give us a different style of animation so we can see how the switch works. because it's all about the switches. So we have one here and one here. And let's call this animation 1, animation 2. I'm going to my library, I'm going to get a switch, and this is a grayscale switch, and we'll have number 1 and number 2. Now, you'll notice that these switches, these switches are different from, let's show multi-switch. The difference between the switch and a multi-switch is a switch is only limited to 2, so it's a Boolean. Multi-switches work on integers, so you can actually determine the number of things you want to switch out. So, you have this, and then you actually select which one of those numbers you want. And, more often than not, you're using the same set of input parameters to drive both kinds of functions. And so that's kind of what we're doing here. We're kind of using these same things, and we're either turning them into integers or turning them into Boolean. None of this is complicated. But that's why I just thought I'd show you this guy, because it's a Boolean. It's a little bit different. But the basic concept is the same. Let's, I don't think, hold on, did we actually make one for this? Animation pattern, animation director, animation. You know what, we didn't make animation. Oh, no, we did. I'm sorry. That's the details. I'm like, it needs its own thing. No, we're going to use this number in here from the float 1 to drive this Boolean, okay? That's why it's a little awkward, because it's more comfortable with an integer because of the way that they, just the incrementation of what the UI is going to have. Well, you'll see. You'll see when I start. We're going to come in here, we're going to do empty function, and we're going to get our variable. And we're going to need to swizzle out that x. And here's where I'm kind of finessing it. We're moving between 0 and 1, so I've just decided that if this swizzled out x is less than or equal to 0.5, we're going to have it be true. Otherwise, it's going to be false. So, it's kind of, well, it works, but it's just from a UI perspective, it's not the prettiest, but it shows you how you can convert one kind of thing into another kind of thing. So we have it set at 1 now. As we're driving it down, it stays the same. It's going to fall below 0.5. It's going to switch out. But doing it this way allows me to just keep it all on the same input parameter. Okay. So that is going to do the style. But what I also want to do is change the direction. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. We could, this right here, this is a non-directional kind of image, which I kind of want, and I wanted to show you kind of a slightly out-of-the-box way of doing it, but it's useful to kind of think of it this way sometimes, because you could take a function and take an image and just like literally take a transform 2D node and flip it 180, and it's going to move from one direction to another. That's not hard to do. But sometimes you need to, like this one, I wanted to have 3 states. I wanted to have a right, a left, and I wanted to have a third state where it's not moving. And it's easier for me to do it this slightly, what I think slightly weird way, but not really. Right. I'm going to get a uniform white. We're going to get a transform 2D, and we are going to get a blend node. And we're going to use this as the mask for this. If we go into this transform 2D node, we'll notice that if I move it along the x, to look at this, and I have to set this to node tiling. So if I start to move this along, if I go to negative 0.5, I'm only seeing the right-hand side. If I go to 0.5, I'm only seeing the left-hand side. And if I'm on 0, I see both sides. That makes it really easy for me to express this as a function. And that is precisely what we're going to do. So we're going to go into our offset. We're going to create an empty function. And we're going to get our variable. So animation direction. We're going to need some numbers. Okay. So let's think about what we're talking about here. If our animation direction is 0, which if we look at here, is the off position. We want our transform 2D to be at the 0, 0, position. Animation direction is 0, then it's in the middle. If animation direction equals 1, which translates to left, then I want my x to be 0.5, and then my y remains 0. Another one of these. And so we'll change that out, and we'll change this out. So if animation direction equals 1, then I have a float 2 with 0.5 on the x and 0 on the y. Otherwise, I want it to go in the opposite direction. I mean, I could write that all over again, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to get a negation. We're going to need another one of these, though. It's going to be the same thing, only backwards. So let's make sure that works, because sometimes I get it backwards. Okay, animation direction, 0. Left, right. Okay, that works. But it's really super big. It's taking up the entire thing. And what I want to actually do is just turn it into a little animation. So I'm going to get a transform node. And, oh, you know what? Let's set its tiling first. I only want to have a band across, just one band of them. So I'm going to set this to absolute. And then only horizontal tiling. And this means that as I bring down the size, it's only going to tile in that one direction. And that's the basis of my mask. But it's still not actually animated. So we come into the transform 2D, and we get into the offset, and we create an empty function. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to add our variable, and we're going to get our direction. Okay, well, let's start first things first. Okay, if the animation direction is 0, then I want nothing to happen. Otherwise, we're going to have an animation, and it's either going to be going to the left or to the right. So the first one, number 1, corresponds to going left. So if animation direction equals 1, then we need to look at the speed, which we have sitting on the animation details. And now we have to swizzle out. Well, we're going to have to swizzle out 2 float 1s because we need to use them in 2 different ways. So I'm just going to duplicate that. And in our animation details, our speed corresponds to the y value, and the location y corresponds to the z value. So we're going to need the y value, and we're going to need the z value. We're also going to need our timer. Oh, I got a constant. What I wanted was a variable. So we're going to get $time, and we're going to multiply it by our speed. And our speed is the swizzle y out of animation details. So that takes care of the movement along the x, which is animated. The movement along the y is not animated. This is a separate slider. This is the z slider, and that's just calling it location y. So this has no timer attached to it. It's just coming straight out of here, and it's the swizzling out the z. And now we have to bring them back together with a vector float 2. So this is our y value, and this is going to be our z value. But here's the thing, where we want to also be able to switch directions. So that's what this is talking about. It's not talking about, in other words, we're segregating out the y because that's always going to be the same. We're going to figure out which direction it goes, and then we're going to tie them back into each other. So if it's 1, it's going to the left. We are going to leave it exactly as is. Again, I'm going by my notes. I always get this backwards, and I just figure it out until I know which direction is corresponding to the positive and which one's corresponding to the negative, because I've never been good with left and right. We're going to need a negation. So it's either going in one direction or the other. And once we figure out what direction it's going in, we're going to put it on top of that static y value, and that goes in there. So If the animation direction is 0, this doesn't go anywhere. Otherwise, it does what happens here. And why don't we plug it in and take a look and see in the player how this works out. So these are our backgrounds, and all we really need to do is add the animation on top. But one of the other things that we needed to do was we want to be able to switch out. Yeah, let's do that before we look in the player. I was going to look in the player just like this, but we might as well just put it in here. We want to be able to pick out which metal texture we want to use for our pattern. So I think it's this one, right? Yeah, pyramids, rectangles, or dots. And what we're going to use for that one is that multi-switch. So we have just simple switch here, which deals with just the Boolean. And now we're going to get a multi-switch, which is going to be able to deal with these 3 colors for us. So I'm coming into the multi-switch, and I'm going to want 3 input numbers. That's telling me how many inputs it'll have. And then this one down here is the input I select. So it's going to go from 1 to 3. And we will put an empty function on here. Oh, you know what I also want to do before I forget? I want to... Oh, you know, it doesn't matter because we're using a drop-down list. Never mind. If it was a slider, we would have limited it because it's if you let it go above the it will by default allow you to go above these 3 numbers, and then you end up with blank, and it's just not nice. But because we're using a drop-down, people won't be able to do that, so that's fine. So we've got our input selection. I'm going to click on that. Let's get in here, and we will get our variable, and we want our animation pattern. And let's take a look at input 1, input 2, input 3. Also, I just want to double check because sometimes, I forgot to do this. 0 will be not right here. It needs to be a 1, a 2, and a 3. So we're going to have to change this. And you can just go up like, it'll keep giving you an error message until you have unique numbers. It doesn't really care otherwise. So that's fine. So we, instead of going from 0 to 2, we're just going to go from 1 to 3. And now it's just a question of trying to remember which one corresponds with 1. So pyramids is blue, that's number 1. So that's input 1 over there. Rectangles is number 2, and that is red. And then the other one is green. And we don't need, we're just going to set that as the output now. That's all it needs. So let's take a look. We've got 3 is dots, 2 is rectangles, 1 is pyramids. So that's giving us the colors we want, and that's what we're going to put on top of here, and we're going to use this mask, and we're going to replace this input. And now we have, ta-da, our patterns. So I'm going to come here, we're going to publish this out, and let's take a look in the player. So direction is off, left. I already saw a problem. It's an easily fixed problem, right? Off. Yeah, we're having a somewhere I'm forgetting to put that Y value is changing. I'm not quite sure what's going on with that, but we'll figure it out. And then we're going to switch our animation. That works. Our speed works. Our location Y works, except for when we're doing something here in the direction. So I think it's the off is the problem, because if we come up here and we change our direction and then we move it to off, it comes back down. Yeah, we'll have to take a look at that. But otherwise, it seems to be so far so good. So it's functioning, but it's monochromatic. So we have to fix that animation, and then we're going to start adding in the colors. So let's go into this transform 2D. I'm going to go into the offset. And I'm pretty sure that this is the problem right here, because I've got this set at 0, 0, so I'm going to use that Z, and that's moved it back up. I'm 99.9% sure that that's going to solve all of that problem. Yeah, that was the problem. So that's good, easily solved. Let's move on. And since we do want to adjust the color, that's kind of why I split it off. It's just going to be easier to deal with. And here's where that second multi-material blend comes in. We've got these ambient occlusions up here that I'm going to also bring into that. And I think it's probably easier just to get another one here. And this one is going to just do the color and the AO. So again, it's going to have 4. No, I'm going to absolutely duplicate this one because we're using the same mask. So this way my colors are all set in. Just going to get rid of this. So we have the same mask, but otherwise it's going to be different. For starters, the channels are going to be different. It's going to have, just the base color and the ambient occlusion, and that's it. So actually, we're not going to get anything out of those. Just want to make sure I'm getting my, I'm plugging my things in the right place. Okay, so material 4 is the dots. Material 3 is the rectangles. And for the background, we're just going to use this white. And for the color, we're just going to get 3 different colors here. Actually, you know what? Again, I'm going to, because we're putting a function on it, we're going to do it on the 1, and then I will copy it out. I'm not sure we put in, no, we didn't put in a color for these. So we can make another input. Let's make 3 inputs. We'll call this color dots, and we'll make it a float 3, and we'll have R, G. Now, you know what? Let's do it as a color wheel. This is probably nicer because people could just pick a color like that. So we'll have a color picker in there, and we'll call this dots, and we'll make the group color, and we'll make some copies of this. All right. And it's just as simple as, well, yeah, no, we can't expose it. I'm going to make an empty function because it wants a float 4, and we've just made a float 3. Yeah, I meant to bring in a variable there. So we'll get our color dots, and we're going to get a constant float 5, and then a vector float 4. So we'll put these 3 in first, and then that one in last, and we've turned it into a float 4, and we've given it opacity, because what we didn't have was this 4th for the alpha. So I just added that in there. And now we can duplicate it 2 more times, and all we need to do now is just change that variable. And we'll plug those colors in there. And let's see what happens when we come in and actually change the colors. So we can make this our base color, and we don't have an ambient inclusion over here. So let's put that, I'm just going to duplicate this, and we'll change it to an AO. Yeah, those colors changed back because I forgot to apply them. So I'm going to hit apply, and then this way when I come back out, it's not going to go away from me. And lo and behold, we have colors. So let's publish it out again and take a look. Maybe even bump it up to 1K. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. Yeah, I mean, this is, you know, it looks pretty crappy, honestly. This isn't much of a material, but we've learned a lot about different ways of manipulating this stuff. So, you know, between a combination of these switches and the color IDs and using functions to change the colors, I think that's something that I think is incredibly useful, because once you realize that you can change, that you can actually do stuff like this with functions, it's not even just about animating or anything else. You can actually switch things out pretty easily. So, yeah, that's it. Yeah, next time we'll make a fun material. I just, I didn't have any ideas for that. I've been holiday making, so I didn't have time to come up with a cool material, but I think this is probably useful too. Anyway, I will see you guys in the next video, and I hope you enjoyed it.